Hello, everyone. Welcome to Auntie M's Heresies, where I go down various theological rabbit holes and see what I can find. This is part 2 of our series called Sarah's Gods, Rebekah's Gods, and Rachel's Gods. In the last episode, Sarah's Gods, we talked about some of the most important, or at least some of the most popular, gods of ancient Sumeria, gods that Sarah, as a historical woman of that time and place, would have been intimately familiar with and, yes, worshipped. Now we'll be looking at society and culture, because there are some important things we need to know if we're going to understand what happens next in this multi-generational family. For starters, let's go back to Sarah's house for a reintroduction. Sarah's household growing up had a father, a couple of wives, and at least 4 kids. Probably more than that. Things get immediately weird, however, at least to modern sensibilities, when you realize that when they were old enough, Sarah and Abraham got married. In the cultural traditions that many of us are used to, this is called incest, and it is not okay. But that isn't even the weirdest thing. Haran has a daughter named Milcah, who marries her uncle Nahor, and eventually, well, hang on. Let's look at this for a minute, because we need to totally adjust our worldview. How is it even thinkable that Sarah could marry her half-brother? And what girl in her right mind would marry her biological uncle? And what kind of father would be okay with it? That depends, really, on how you define a household. The kind of system that many people today are most accustomed to is called patriarchy, because a household is traditionally defined by its patriarch, or governing father. Inheritance passes through the male line, and a daughter goes to live with her husband's family most of the time. If she's lucky, she'll get something too, a dowry to help her get started in her new home. In this kind of system, there are a lot of restrictions about who can marry whom. There have to be, because, well, let's be honest, this is a fundamentally weak system of inheritance. Without DNA testing, it can be awfully hard to know whether your sons are actually yours, or if they were fathered by someone else. One of the simplest and most effective methods for ensuring bloodline inheritance in this kind of system is to restrict access to the patriarch's breeding partner, keeping her safe from unauthorized men, or from all men really, because none of them can be trusted to see a woman as a human being rather than a power source. See, a large household is a fundamental source of power and authority, and the size of the household is determined by its number of children, and that is determined by the number of childbearing women. Of course, not all women can bear children, and not all women can give birth to many children. So what's a patriarch to do? The answer is, of course, more women. This is why we get so bothered by Sarah's marriage to her half-brother. In the patriarchal system, all of these people are in the same household. Incest rules all over the world state that marriage within the same household is not okay. Unless you're a god king of ancient Egypt, of course, but ugh. And this is only one way of defining a household. And as we've already seen, it's not actually efficient. It's also really toxic, because it allows only 2 ways of being in the world. There is very little room in this system for a woman who can't have children. Even worse is, say, a marriageable, eligible woman who doesn't want to be married, or even a marriageable, eligible man who doesn't or can't father children. They exist anyway, of course, but they don't necessarily belong. What does this have to do with Sarah's family? Everything. Our first hint that Sarah did not live in a patriarchal society, not as we think of it anyway, is because of her marriage, which was perfectly legal because she and Abraham had different mothers. This means that they didn't just have different mothers, it means that they lived in different households. In this model, then, we're looking at 3 households, not 1, and that means that we're looking at the remnants, at least, of a matriarchy. This shouldn't be terribly surprising. After all, Adam's first and only recorded commandment to all of humanity states that a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave unto his wife, which is exactly the opposite of patriarchic practice, and that's our second hint. So, What does society look like when boys leave home to get married and when household identity is determined by your mother rather than your father? First, a system like this does not need any of the restrictions that patriarchy does, because it is a good deal more difficult to falsify the process of giving birth than it is to fake conception. Nor can a woman bear more children if she has more lovers, so harems of whatever gender are redundant. As a result, neither women nor men have to worry about being reduced to breeding stock. Children are not guaranteed because fertility is fickle. When they do come, there is no need to segregate them or force them into a false binary. Forced gender roles serve no real purpose. A person able and willing to have children will do so and reap the benefits. A person who cannot, well, the continued story of Sarah tells us what happens when a person cannot. As beautiful as Sarah was, and although she spent plenty of time in the courts of kings, she couldn't have children. She and Abraham had been promised children, however, and Sarah intended to see that promise fulfilled. She suggested using a surrogate mother, in fact, her maid, Hagar. And here's where everything went sideways. Hagar didn't become a surrogate mother for Sarah. She became Abraham's second wife, and pretty soon she became pregnant. Here is where we get our first huge culture clash, and here's our third hint that Sarah wasn't raised in a patriarchal society. As soon as it became obvious that Hagar was the mother of the promised offspring, she started moving in on Sarah's authority, and if she'd been back in Egypt, maybe it would have worked. Abraham wouldn't have been the first to throw over his infertile first wife for the fertile second wife, after all. But this wasn't Egypt, and Hagar wasn't a member of Abraham's household. She was a member of Sarah's. This is reiterated several times when Sarah chastises Abraham for giving Hagar false ideas about her own authority, and when Hagar, fleeing into the wilderness, receives revelation about her son. Hagar does have a son, Ishmael, and he is almost grown by the time Sarah miraculously gets pregnant. We get more hints that Hagar's relationship with Sarah hasn't improved any, and that she has taught the same disrespect to her son, Ishmael. Ishmael, although the precious and beloved eldest son, gets himself and his mother kicked out of the household when Sarah sees him mocking her joy over miraculously becoming a mother. Once again, even though Abraham isn't happy about it, Sarah is in charge of who stays and who goes in what is obviously her household. And now we come to the next really important moment, the time of inheritance. Sarah dies, leaving her husband and her son behind. What happens next? Well, Abraham gets married again, but he doesn't give his new wife Sarah's tent or household goods. Once again, those things are Sarah's. They're not even Isaac's, not really. What does Abraham do? He sends his servant to find Isaac a wife. But not just any wife. He wants Isaac to have a wife from back home, from his own people, who are also, if you remember, Sarah's people. A woman from Sarah's people would be a legitimate heir for her household goods, and presumably someone Sarah would approve of, her son, marrying. Back to our little pedigree chart. We do not know who Haran's wife was. Was she one of Sarah's sisters? Was she someone totally different? What we do know is that Milcah was Sarah's paternal niece and her paternal sister-in-law. Milcah's son Bethuel had 2 children by his nameless wife, Laban and Rebekah. When Abraham's servant went back to Samaria looking for a wife for Isaac, Rebekah is who he found. Isaac's first cousin twice removed. Ish. Now let's look at this from Sarah's point of view, even though she was dead by the time Rebekah came into her tent. Rebekah, however miraculously discovered, was both Sarah's great-niece and her great-great-niece. Either way, she was family, and thus a legitimate matriarchal choice for inheriting Sarah's household goods. The bride price that Abraham's servant paid for Rebekah could as easily be treated as an adoption fee. Rebekah was going to become her aunt's successor. Rebekah came from Samaria just as Sarah had. Rebekah knew the same gods. She would have recognized An and Enki and Enlil and Inanna and Nana, who in some accounts are father and daughter, in some accounts siblings. She would have known the rights of women that were practiced in the house, the ways of cooking and cleaning and worshiping the gods that women of her family and her people knew, that outsiders would not. This is what Rebekah brought with her to her new husband's family. This culture was clearly important to Abraham and to Isaac. Was it important to Rebekah too? Absolutely. This becomes blatantly apparent in the story of how her sons Esau and Jacob got their wives. Esau married 2 local girls first, and Rebekah despised them. Seeing that he'd messed up with that, Esau tried to mend fences by marrying one of his uncle Ishmael's daughters. But that didn't work either. Rebekah refused to have anything to do with any of them. She was not going to give her household goods to a cultural outsider, no matter how closely related, and she told Jacob to go find a wife from her people. Jacob got lucky. Laban, Rebekah's brother, had 2 marriageable daughters. Leah and Rachel both shared Rebekah's beliefs and Sarah's beliefs and followed the old ways in a time when they were quickly disappearing. The elder of the girls would have already been the matriarchal heir of Laban's household. Jacob was therefore free to take the younger girl home to be his mother's heir and his wife. This was win-win for the daughters. Each would get a full inheritance and be the head of her own multi-generational household. The snag showed up when Leah, the elder sister, fell in love with Jacob. That story is awfully melodramatic and does not need to be rehearsed here, but Jacob ended up marrying both sisters. Leah was the elder, the first wife, and Rebekah's heir. As for Rachel, well, she took over Leah's position, even if the scriptures don't spell that out, and that story, we'll pick that up in part 3. Thanks for watching.